Within the next month, we will have not only the Addis Conference on Financing for Development, within what's left of this month, we will have the Addis Conference on Financing for Development. We will also have the BRICS Summit, and with it the launch of the New Development Bank. So there really couldn't be a better moment for reflecting on the contribution of the rising powers to the Sustainable Development Goals and future prospects for sustainable development on the planet. So, just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Alex Shanklin. I'm a research fellow here at the Institute of Development Studies. I work on the Brazil program of the Centre for Rising Powers and Global Development, which is based here at IDS, involving colleagues from across the campus, from the School of Global Studies, from the SPRU, Science, Technology, Policy Research, from the Department of Economics in the Business School. So we have an excellent broad base of colleagues working with us under the leadership of my colleague Jingu. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here by, first of all, Jennifer Constantine, who is lead author of the briefing that has prompted this seminar, Advertising Break, downloadable from the IDS website. IDS Rapid Response Briefing number 9, Understanding the Rising Powers Contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So Jenny, who was born and brought up in Brazil, Mozambique, and is now based here in the UK, and has worked for a long time with us on developing the Rising Powers International Development Programme here at IDS, worked very closely with Mars Pontual from the team headed by our next contributor, Dr. Romulo Paes de Souza, at the UN World Centre for Sustainable Development, Rio Plus, in Rio, on this briefing. And she's going to talk a bit about the research process of this joint venture, as well as the key findings from the briefing. Dr. Romulo Paes de Souza, Senior International Associate at the Institute of Development Studies, a very distinguished and valued contributor to the Rising Powers Programme from its outset here. Formerly Deputy Minister for Social Development in the Government of Brazil, and currently heading the UN World Centre for Sustainable Development, Rio Plus, in Rio de Janeiro. Absolutely delighted to have Romulo here with us. And similarly delighted to welcome back Richard Manning, hugely distinguished actor in the recent evolution of the development cooperation architecture, from his position not only with the Department for International Development, subsequently as chair of the OECD DAC, and now taking it easy at Oxford. Distinguished fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, and we're absolutely delighted to have Richard back with us. And symbolising our partnership with the University of Sussex, we're absolutely thrilled to have the Director of Research from the School of Global Studies here at Sussex, and Professor of International Relations, Peter Newell, who has a glittering academic career in the field of international relations and development, including some time at IDS. And so Pete will be concluding our panel's contributions by linking this to broader debates on global governance at this very significant juncture. So I'm going to ask Jenny to kick off by outlining the process that led to the production of this briefing and some of the key findings. Romulo will then set that in context, speaking particularly in relation to his very intense ongoing dialogue with the government of Brazil about their role in the post-2015 process. We'll then ask Richard to comment, and finally Pete will wrap up the panel. That process should take us until about 10 to 2. So we will then have a round of questions, and we will... What's the arrangement for online? Gary, are you on hand for questions from the online audience?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we are.
We should be advertising or not?
If they just use the Twitter handle.
The Twitter handle.
@IDS_UK.
@IDS_UK. That will reach Hannah, who will let us know about questions coming in from the online audience. We will then take a short break after that first round of questions. We'll take a short break at 2 p.m, which is IDS customary break, as colleagues who have meetings at 2 p.m. tend to rush off. But we will then stay for a further 30 minutes after that for a further couple of rounds of questions, what I hope will be a rich and stimulating debate. Okay, so many thanks, and over to Jen.
Thanks, Alex. Right.
Hopefully that's loud enough. Alex, will you keep time if I... Right, I get quite enthused when talking about this, so I'm going to try and keep to my allocated 10 minutes. So speaking a little bit about the process, Alex mentioned that this was done with the RIO Centre in a partnership between IDS and the Rising Powers and RIO Plus, and also my co-author Marcio Pontoir, who's a senior policy analyst at the RIO Plus. So the origin of this work came from having conversations with quite a range of actors, both in the BRICS and also in the UK and at various conferences, be it the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation or different conferences and workshops with the DAC and the UN and elsewhere. And a common thread that came up in conversation was this idea that the BRICS are being really difficult, really obstructive in this process where finally we have a commitment to universal development goals in the SDGs, no longer this north-south, rich country to poor country arrangement. And we would have discussions with all these people, based on the research that we do in the centre, and say, well, it's not quite like that. There's a different narrative here. But then, of course, people ask to say, well, do you have something you could send us? And that's what gave rise to doing this brief, and also because there's a very, very particular, I think, conjuncture at the moment where, of course, the Open Working Group at the time was still meeting, and so we felt that there was an opportunity to actually provide a bit of insight into what was happening on the ground in the capitals as well as in New York, because as we know, there's always a bit of discrepancy between what happens at the country level and how these things play into national interests, and then what happens in New York or Paris, or now with the AIIB, Beijing, or is it Shanghai? Shanghai. So that's a little bit about how this came about. Marcio and I did a series of interviews over the space of about 10 days with the different government ministries involved in the process in Brazil. We set out to talk about the BRICS, but in the end we wanted to focus on China and Brazil. And we spoke a little bit about the others. You'll see, those of you who have the brief, that it's very thin. Unfortunately, there's only a couple of paragraphs for the others, but there's more research coming on that soon. So Brazil has got quite an interesting institutional arrangement for working on this. There is, in a way almost mirroring perhaps the arrangement of the working group, an intergovernmental working group, which brings a selection of ministries in Brazil working on things which pertain to social development. The invite was made by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Itamaraty, to all ministries who had an interest in participating. Of course, as is often the case, this then narrows down and you get a smaller group who would come regularly and who would debate some of these issues. And of course, everyone trying to put forward their particular agenda, be it sustainable cities, be it social protection, be it the environment, family agriculture, etc. So we thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how the SDGs would feed into national policy-making processes as a way of understanding how this was then feeding into what we were hearing in New York about Brazil being an obstructive actor. And I think I can say this, and I'm not kind of breaking any confidences by mentioning that every time I would walk into a ministry, and Marcio would introduce me because he'd worked with government, so he knew a lot of the people, they would say, so I don't understand, are you British or are you Brazilian? And I would say, no, I'm Brazilian. You were born here. Yeah, no, I was born here, but my father's English. Ah, okay. And it was like, okay, we can speak frankly now, because Brazilians are actually fairly diplomatic, and I think that was helpful in this sense of trying to actually get a feel for what was happening, because I think I would have heard a slightly different take on things had I come there as a Brit. So positionality, as always, is really important. And of course, what came out of this, and the same goes actually for the Chinese academics that I interviewed. I didn't speak to anyone from government, but mainly academics and people working in think tanks, is that like the UK and like every other country involved in the Open Working Group or in the parallel processes that help negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals, each country is fighting to make sure that their own interests are represented. It's as simple as that. Brazil is no more obstructive than the UK or China. And actually, if you look at what's happening on the ground, you see something very different. So I talked about the Open Working Group in the context of Brazil. Perhaps more exciting was the finding that even though the SDGs have still not been formally agreed, Brazil had already made a commitment internally in terms of its policy making, policy planning process to align the pluriannual plan to the SDG framework. This is pretty major. You might be seen as being very obstructive in New York, but actually when it comes to it, what you're doing in the national context is very different. So that I thought was very interesting, and again pointing to the fact that perhaps we need to look at what happens in the capitals and in national policy making processes rather than, you know, the sort of shiny stuff that happens in New York. Another finding was that Brazil, of course, was acting very much in the way that other G77 members or even BRICS members were, which is saying, look, we have a commitment to CBDR, to common but differentiated responsibilities here, which ties into, of course, FFD, which perhaps Richard or Romlo might talk about. But if we're talking about universal Sustainable Development Goals, we're also talking about how we share the burden of development and the responsibilities as well, so the rights and responsibilities. And Brazil's position is very much that, you know, we respect the sovereignty of other countries, and therefore we are not going to necessarily take a stand on how things should or shouldn't be. If we say that this is a universal process, then we're all going to sit around the table and we're going to thrash this out until we reach some kind of conclusion. And if you look at the structure itself of the SDGs, and perhaps this is how I should have started off, there's something very exciting actually about how they were negotiated. I mentioned before that it wasn't a rich country to poor country arrangement like the MDGs were, the Millennium Development Goals. And at the same time, it wasn't just about defining what happens in terms of development in poor countries. This is about saying, okay, we're going to look at much as development in the UK or Germany or Denmark as we are in Brazil, Russia or China. This is pretty revolutionary, actually. And more interesting, in the context of the UN, this was reflected in the institutional arrangements for how the Open Working Group worked. So instead of having the usual country groupings, you had a different arrangement. You had 70 countries in some quite unusual groupings represented in 30 seats. Bashing this out, some of you, I don't know if you've been accompanying the process, you'll see that there are discussions on every topic under the sun that linked to the 17 goals. Which again brings us to the 17 goals and the positions that different countries have had in terms of whether 17 is too many, just right, not enough. And let's not forget the 169 indicators. My and Marciu's take on this, which you may see in the brief, is that actually 17 goals is what it took for all those people to sit around the table and feel that they were participating equally in a process that was going to lead to universal sustainable development goals. And so the UK may have worked very hard to try and get it down to 10, maximum 12, but actually in this emerging configuration, it's not countries like the UK who get to call the shots anymore. And so that, again, I think is a shift, actually, a paradigm shift in the way that development happens globally. It's no longer about the OECD DAC countries, the rich country donor club. There are actually other players in the mix now, and some of them are very, very powerful. And some of these powerful countries, like China, are often heavily criticized by another big powerful country, like the US, for example, who also doesn't want to very frequently play by some of these rules. But if you look at what China's doing, 1 minute, dear me, if you look at what China's doing, again, what it does at the country level really, really differs to how it might be perceived in some of these global policy spaces. So having been considered, again, an obstructive member of the negotiations, particularly for climate change, not so much for SDGs, we then saw a bilateral agreement for climate change being made between the US and China. So I have so much more that I'd like to say, but I'm going to maybe conclude on one thing. I think the key lesson that emerged from all of this is that the game has changed. We're no longer in a world where things are decided by a very small group of countries for everyone. We're no longer in a world where norms apply, or they do apply, but of course the decisions are made in different spaces. So in the same way that... You're alarmed. I've been told by a barking dog that my time is up. But just to conclude this point, if I may take a few seconds longer, the old rules of the game don't apply anymore, or they certainly don't apply in the same space. There is much more change, much more flux. We have new actors in the game who weren't traditionally involved in global policy spaces as change makers or decision makers. They were always participants. They went along, they collaborated with other countries who had similar positions to them, and then they tried somehow to get their point across. That's changed. And I think this actually could be beneficial in terms of offering alternatives to smaller countries. And very, very last point, to not just talk about the BRICS, in the mix of all this, we also have African countries who traditionally haven't had a very visible presence or a very loud voice in the context of the UN. And what was interesting in the SDGs is that for once they said, okay, we're stepping away from the G77 position, or in the case of South Africa, from the BRICS, and we are going to develop a common African position. So great unity, actually, and cohesion between a very, very, very diverse continent with very different interests, very different politics. And so there's something unifying about these universal sustainable development goals, which shouldn't be dismissed as just another UN process, another set of shiny little icons that will be used to illustrate, maternal and child health or whatever it may be. Not that those things aren't very, very important, but I think this is an opportunity to actually reconfigure the way we talk about sustainable development in our world. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Jenny. So I'm going to hand straight over to Romola.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here to see old friends and new friends here in IDS. I really enjoy to be here. I'd like to go from the point that Jenny had to stop before the dog bites her, which is, if you look what happened in Millennium Development Goals process, it started as a very consistent technical model, but with some needs for political legitimacy, because the countries came later supporting the process. By the way, they decided to accept the model of Millennium Development Goals. What I see here is exactly the opposite in terms of how the countries from the South observing and acting inside the process. It starts as something really representative in terms of the political process, but lacks of technical consistency. Let me explain better what I'm trying to say. If you look in the Millennium Development Goals, you see small numbers of goals, 8. It's very consistent inside the model when you think about indicators. And when you compare to Sustainable Development Goals, you think about 169 targets with more than 300 indicators. And you may think, well, how feasible is this model in technical terms? And then it's important to see how the countries like Brazil are seeing this. Well, that is the price of a more democratic process, a more horizontal process, a process more inclusive. So it's the price of democracy, inclusiveness, and so on. At the same time, many countries have pointed that how feasible is this model? So to understand how countries like Brazil are observing that, they see, first, it's very important to see in a very flexible model. So it's not something, think about the indicators. We are supposed to define the indicators March next year. The point is, should we have a closed set of indicators, or is that possible to revise the indicators later? Because in some areas, it's not clear exactly how we are going to access the implementation process in the countries. So flexibility is a key point to understand how countries in the G77 are expecting to have in the end of the process, what they are expected to see. Another issue. So if we believe that a spot is already set in political terms, the basis for the process, of course the countries are very reluctant to negotiate anything before the last minute. And why? Because they fear that if they start to negotiate now, they can have to be too flexible inside the negotiation. So they say, well, they've been very obstructive. No, because they achieved what they are looking for. That's the point. And they feel this model is very comprehensive and very inclusive. So that's why they are fighting to keep what it was achieved during the open working group. So I do believe that some things can be changed still. However, it's going to happen in the last minute. I don't believe the countries are interested to open up big process of negotiation in terms of goals and targets. In the case of indicators is another important thing, because we still have some time. And now what we have on the table, which is a set of indicators with some classical indicators and the other new indicators, every country is what we have. Because in some way, the nations were focused on very much on the political process, and now it comes to the technical part, and in some way they are behind this schedule. Another important thing that I see in this process is what really matters now. In the eve of the Addis meeting, in the eve very close to the UN Assembly in September, and also about COP in Paris in December. So what is on stake? First is about the ways of implementation. The countries are very concerned, but not just about funding, because many people have seen Addis as the perfect space to define everything about the implementation of these Sustainable Development Goals or post-2015 agenda. But what many countries are saying is, well, it's important, it will cover important aspects of the debate, however, it is something beyond. And what is beyond? So it's not just about funding, it's also about technological transfer. It's also about cooperation. It's also about to have a clear framework for interacting the countries. South-South cooperation, or as other ways of interacting different countries in order to share some solutions in terms of public policy the countries have developed. What else? Well, governance. So what's happened after? Because as you know, countries like Brazil, they are not so normative. They are flexible, they have high degree of adaptability, and they see many times that process, if it is very normative, as a way to hold the process, or controlling the process, or keeping the countries asphyxiating in some way. Maybe they have some reason to say that. Anyway, the point is, it's important to know how we are going to access the implementation process. So it's not just about the ways, but also it's about how we are going to evaluate that. And also, it's very important to understand that it's not closed model. As I said, it's possible to revise, not just indicators. Why not to revise at some point in the future what we have defined here? What is interesting for countries that see the process like this is because they have in their backgrounds some political experience to work in very complex political environment. Can be an advantage, can be a problem. Can be an advantage when you see a model as more contemporary process, more democratic, at the same time very flexible. However, can be also a problem because if you have some instability inside the countries, instability inside the countries that are leading the process, yes, it is also a problem. So, but what's interesting in this process, the countries, think about emerging powers like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, or other countries where they are so used to deal with very complex political contests. So they can feel this is, what's the problem to have 169 targets? It's okay. Yeah. I was talking to just some officials Wednesday, and they here in the UK, and sometimes I see it sounds, wow, this is so strange because you say 17 goals. It's a lot. Yes, it's a lot. If you, as I said, as a technical challenge, it'll be a problem. When I talk to the statistical bureaus in other countries, they fear the process because how to deal with so many indicators, how to deal with undefined process of monitoring. However, when I talk to the diplomats, they are very engaged in this debate. They say, great, something like this should be wide, should be bold, should be democratic, should be crazy sometimes, but it's the price, and they are willing to pay. So, considering that, those countries, exactly middle income countries, where they have at the same time this ability to navigate in so complex political environment and have a lot of technical capacity, they are in a position that is a big challenge for them. And for them, they are now facing the burden to be a leader in that process. Because the other countries are asking, okay, how we are going to implement that? They know that G77 has been very important in this process. They contributed a lot, but a lot of them have very little capacity, technical capacity for the implementation. So the point now is how we are going to help the other countries to develop that capacity. To finish, and just to avoid the dog.
4 minutes till the dog.
Yeah, this better be a generous dog, I'd say so. But so the challenge now is after this political process, as I said, that we will start with strong political legitimacy. How the technical part will be consistent with that. Because we can see as a paradox where you have countries who are not so comfortable with this so complex political contest, have some difficulties to be more flexible, have a lot of difficulties to change the institutional arrangement because they have some tradition. Think about a country that has defined social class in 100 years, and you come again to change, well, let's change the indicators. Think of countries that have Census Bureau for more than 300 years, and let's come again to say, well, let's do a different arrangements, bringing different institutions to that part. Think a country that has developed a lot of indicators about the environment, including use of water. And now let's say, well, maybe we could revise that. I'm sure you have considered many potential countries that can fit in this model. And so they have some difficulties to, even internally, to how to deal with that. But they have a lot of technical capacity. If they decide to go ahead, they can do that quickly. So it's much more about mindset rather than the possibility to do. But mid-income countries, they can do that quickly. But the point is how they feel themselves inside the process. We can have different behaviors. You can have countries that are keen to lead, other countries that are reluctant, tending to define themselves as we should care about ourselves. We have little capacity to help the others. And sometimes that's not true. However, so we are in the point that we will start next year with a clear definition, very much similar what we have now in terms of what came from the open working groups, a set of indicators with many problems in terms of to define the methodology and even to define the concepts. But they will come out in March next year. And then it will come the tough part, the implementation, and the governance, the arrangements, institutional arrangements to deal with this. But to be honest to you, just to finish, I prefer very much that this process is going to be like this. Thank you. Just before the door, you see.
58 seconds before the door. Thank you so much, Robin. Okay, so I'd like to hand over back to Richard now to follow on from that.
Thank you very much. I suppose my starting point is that the underlying problem that we're all grappling with is that we're living on a relatively small and increasingly interconnected planet with an increasing number of people on it. We expect population to level off at 9 billion or so in the middle of the century if we get it right, and we know about the environmental and other stresses taking place. But we also know, and this particular focus of IDS, is that on this highly interconnected planet, there are enormous both inter-country and intra-country disparities. And it's very hard to see how we pull off the trick of managing a sustainably managed planet in the medium term if we don't find ways of much more cooperative behaviour, both within countries, but in particular between countries, than we've actually managed over the past. Though let's at least congratulate ourselves on avoiding major wars since the Europeans gave up fighting each other a few years ago. So the question, I think, when you look at the whole SDG business is, can this contribute in some meaningful way to a sustainable outcome? And it's therefore worth asking oneself, what's the point of the SDGs, or indeed what was the point of the MDGs? And I think people need to be realistic about this. These are not legal frameworks. They don't bind anybody to anything. There are no rules. You're not going to be taken to court. Nothing's going to happen like that. The virtue of the MDGs, if there was a virtue, and this was very much contested, I think the MDGs became more popular later on than they were initially. More people began to see some point in it. And I think to the extent people saw a point in it was that it provided, if you like, the theory of change underlying this was not that rules would change you, but that evidence would change you. And that evidence presented in a regular, comparable, consistent way, and this is why getting the indicators right is so important, as Ron has said. At least, if nothing else, it helps advocates put issues on the agenda in an effective way. I think if you look what happened over maternal and child health in the mid-2000s, it's a pretty reasonable example of that. But these things are not, they're only part of anything. They're not going to change the world on their own. They're providing a resource, and we ought to try and get it as right as possible. And I very much agree with what Romelu said about the process, and having been involved with the initial process when, we thought 8 goals were probably too many. I know Claire Short was aghast when we told her there'd be, 60 indicators. I think you have to accept that we need a wider framework of the kind we've got. The big issues to me is that whereas the MDGs were very largely designed by donors to essentially justify why aid was still worth giving at a time when people were giving up on an aid process. And thus, all of 1 to 6, most of 7, were all designed with that in mind. Well, now, this comes not from the donors, it comes from Colombia and others, saying we need a different approach to making the planet sustainable. And that has if it's taken seriously, that has a huge impact, particularly in the north, because nobody had to worry about the MDGs in the north except aid agencies and foreign ministries. If you take the SDGs seriously, then all sorts of domestic ministries have to take them seriously. And I think they probably don't, but I think it's down to advocates to force them to do this. I think that's how it's going to work. It's not that the British Department of this or that is going to regard this as the most important thing that they are accountable for. But of course, if civil society, politicians, the rest of it, keep confronting them with evidence that Britain is looking badly out of line on A, B or C, then that becomes part of politics. And I think that's how this whole thing can and should work. So I think it's a great achievement that I think we've now got to the point where I'm sure there'll be lots of excitement between here and September, but I think this has the look of a negotiation that, as I remember being told in Brussels many years ago when we joined the common market, some negotiations are condemned to succeed, and I think this one is condemned to succeed. Whether it achieves anything, we'll have to see. FFD, of course, is going to be a way of reflecting on one underpinning part of this, which is the resource side, much of it, of course, domestic and increasingly so, correctly, but also the international transfers, and I think much more emphasis needing to be placed not so much on concessional transfers, though I regard them as very important as long as you've got huge inter-country disparities, but the whole issue of how resources are accessed, and I think the international tax dialogue, for example, looks much more important to me than a lot of the other things that have been talked about. The problem as I see it is that in several spaces, governance is not adapting quickly enough to changing realities. And I'm going to give you two quick examples. One is in relation to economics and the IFIs, and the second in relation to divergent interests within the UN system. And on the IFIs, in a sense, whereas one country, one vote is very sensible for certain things, there are some issues in the world which are best dealt with by reflecting the relative strength of countries in economic terms. And the IFIs were set up in the 1940s on that model, and I think it's a principle that, to my mind, has a lot to commend it. Tuvalu is not as important as the United States from certain points of view, and that needs to be a way of recognising that. So, the trouble, in my view, is that a very good principle is not, in fact, being applied. It's not being applied because the people who were very important in the world economy and are seeing their share diminish, and that's broadly speaking the European countries, are not willingly transferring shares, selling shares, giving away shares to countries whose stake in the world economy is growing. And we need to move away from this business where it's all a kind of negotiation in which everything you win, somebody else loses, to one where there's simply an automatic rule that the votes in these big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank will reflect some indicators of size in the world economy, and that's the end of it. We're not in that world. The Europeans are at the moment hiding behind the fact that the US Congress can't bring itself to reduce its position in the IMF, although the US is not, broadly speaking, overrepresented in these institutions in its economic way. The Europeans, to my mind, should simply sell some of their shares to countries that whose weight in the world economy has come, and that could be done in any of the regional banks, the World Bank, tomorrow. And there's no evidence that Europe is thinking at all strategically about this, other than trying to defend its indefensible position. You've seen the results of this. The countries that have the ability to do something about it, like the BRICS and China, are now setting up a series of institutions with different shareholdings. China, I think, is going to have 26% of the AIIB, I can't remember. And you've also seen this very fascinating month earlier this year when the UK took a particular position, and within minutes, almost every other country in the world, apart from the United States and Japan, had taken the same position. So, very interesting swing point. So that needs to be sorted. And in the UN, I think it's evident, and Jenny, you referred to this, that the kind of bloc politics system of the UN is very much not fit for purpose in a situation where the interests are much more divergent. And I don't think anybody, other than the diplomats in New York, think the New York process has anything much to commend it. And in most areas, environment, whatever, you've got to bring people together who understand the issues and have the right kind of framework within which they can work. We've not been very good at doing this. The WTO has not been great at doing it either. But the bloc politics thing will simply condemn the UN to a very marginal role in anything as long as it continues in the way it has. So I think that's the main points I want to get across. And I'd just like to finish by just telling one little story about the MDGs. I do think there is scope for things to happen after 2015. A very interesting one is that the whole business of reproductive health was banned from the MDGs under an alliance between the Vatican, Iran and the United States, but crept back in by other means, but I think around 2010 if I'm not wrong. It is possible to change these things. They will change over time between now and 2030, which is quite a long way away. And we do need a very good technical process to try and make them as effective and as measurable as possible. One thing I think requires serious attention in this area, which is not getting, is that a lot of our data comes from mixed sources. One of the most important is the three big international surveys, DHS, the World Bank and UNICEF equivalents. I do think we need a new approach to looking at how fit for purpose the whole international survey system is in relation to the SDGs. I think that would be a good thing to be looked at seriously between now and next March. Thank you.
Thanks very much, leadership. Beating the dog again. There's obviously a certain canophobia going around the table.
I fully expect to be bitten. Great, thanks very much. I'd like to basically make three key points, or raise three questions, sort of taking this onto the terrain of the sort of bigger global politics of what's going on here. One is around the extent to which the model being promoted, development model being promoted by raising powers that are the focus of the discussion today, is really offers an alternative. Is one of the things I want to reflect on at the moment. So I guess I'm a little bit more sceptical maybe than Jenny about the level of change, the extent to which the sort of development landscape and architecture is changing. The second is around the role of the state in all of this. Obviously, we're talking about interstate negotiations at the moment, but I want to sort of put that in a bigger picture and draw in some of the other actors that will be as important, I think, in realising the SDGs. And then one or two reflections on what's missing from this agenda as far as I'm concerned. So firstly on this question of, what's the alternative model of development that rising powers are said to be advocating or demonstrating? Given repeated failures to address inequality, gender inequities, access to resources, sustainable development within existing development paradigms, we have to ask, I think, what's the reason to believe that right now, at this particular historical moment, we have the tools and the approaches to address what's referred to in draft 0 of the SDG document as the structural drivers of poverty, inequality and sustainable development. And clearly these are very complex challenges that have been around for a long time, but in a way we have to ask, why has more progress not been made so far in a world where there is so much wealth, albeit very poorly distributed? Why do we still need SDGs if our development models are right or if they're so successful? So specifically, is there anything new about the way in which rising powers are contributing to or talking about or intervening in the world of development? And I think the briefing rightly picks up on some of the success in China around reducing inequality. You could talk about increasing investments in clean and low carbon technologies, which will make a huge contribution. India, China, Brazil, all making important contributions in that regard. You could say there's a different way of doing development diplomacy that many of these countries have, focused more around cooperation, solidarity, as you know, this is the discourse, rather than more sort of predatory interventions of the past. There's a lot of technology sharing, cooperation going on, etc. Maybe you could say there's something about the role of the state that we can learn from the ways in which rising powers are now involved in international development. A more interventionist, state-led, entrepreneurial, if you like, state. And there are important lessons to be learned, therefore, for richer countries, perhaps despite their ideological hostility to it. So this could be something there about rebalancing development thinking about the role of the state in providing some of these key services around health, education, water, etc. And again, you rightly note in these contributions that the rapid and real progress that's being made in rising powers in relation to national frameworks, but at the same time, perhaps they're not the models of inclusive development. So if we're expecting them to take a leadership role and to help us achieve these SDGs, I think we need some more critical scrutiny about how likely it is these countries are to lead the battle for sustainable energy for all, gender equity, access to services, etc. Despite talk about India shining, the Silk Path, or whatever it might be. So what is it that genuinely unites the BRICS or the rising powers in this sense? Clearly there's shared historical experiences, often ones grounded around exploitation of one sort or another. There's a set of demands around access to global institutions, most obviously the Security Council, but also pushing for reform of the Bretton Woods institutions in the ways we've just heard. But does that constitute an alternative development vision? I guess I have my doubts. And again, there's three key words that appear in the preamble at the very start of draft 0 of the SDGs. And it's people, planet and prosperity. And if you look at the rising powers, I think they're as tied as other countries to very conventional ideas about growth, about how to achieve it, about how to measure it. And maybe they're not as successful as we're being led to believe at the moment around distributing resources within countries, never mind addressing some of these inequities between countries. And the draft also talks about the need for fundamental changes in the way societies produce and consume. And I wonder how many countries, whether rising powers or not, can honestly say they're making real progress in that direction. And I think this is where the universality aspect is really important. So this isn't any longer about fixing development problems in the global south. It's as much about the effect of the policies of northern governments and northern economic actors in particular, perhaps trade policies, tax evasion, these sorts of things, on these issues. And this is particularly the case, as Jenny's briefing makes clear, if you're talking about consumption, finance, climate change, we have to have that bigger global picture, particularly if we're framing this around common but differentiated responsibility. So that's sort of point number one, or big question. What's the alternative that we're assuming is going to come from this shifting geography of power, if you like? Secondly, the role of the state, really. As I said, we are talking about this as an interstate process, and there's good reasons for that. But the extent to which we're able to achieve any of these SDGs will ultimately be about levering private investment. The private actors are clearly key to all of this. Less so in some contexts than others, given what I've just said about the role of the state in China in particular, but elsewhere too. But levering private actors and their finance will be critical here. Likewise, I'm not sure where the role of activists and social movements and NGOs and all of this is, because in terms of lobbying for access to services, holding the state to account, questioning state action, all of this is going to be absolutely vital, I think, to delivering the SDGs. And again, if you look at the text of the document, it talks, as it would in UN language, about we the peoples. But we have to ask which peoples are being talked about, because many state elites, and we probably need to be honest about this, do very, very well out of unsustainable development. So again, we're making lots of assumptions about where the agency lies or where the drivers of change are going to come from, which might not always be entirely accurate. As we've already heard, poverty is not going to be addressed by new targets or better diplomacy per se, albeit roadmaps and targets can provide a point for trying to mobilise resources. But again, as your briefing notes, China's big social development successes resulted more from national policy rather than international efforts per se. So that's the second point. The third one is then what's missing from this agenda? What are the silences? What are the elephants in the room, if you like? What's not up for grabs in this discussion? And I think one thing that struck me looking at this, and I know the briefing picked up on this, has been a big point of contention, is around militarism and war. War as development in reverse, and the vast expenditure that continues to go on military machines of one sort or another. And obviously it disproportionately impacts on the poor, it consumes vast amounts of resources. Now, I know China's been keen in these discussions to separate out security and development, and the Africa group has been far more proactive in trying to bring that conversation, bring those two conversations back together, but it strikes me that that's one key area. A second, which Richard has just alluded to, is around the rules of the global economy. Again, BRICS countries have been pushing for this, but there is clearly a need for much further and more substantial reform of the Bretton Woods institutions if poorer countries are to have the developmental space, the policy autonomy, if you like, to actually deliver on some of these things. So I think, if we're talking about energy access, We need to think about infant industries, about subsidies, about intellectual property rights protection. These things will require some shifts within the World Trade Organization and elsewhere within the system. Because potentially what we'll see, I think, as we get into the implementation and the real tricky issues here is which are the appropriate fora for settling some of these issues. And in international relations, people often talk about forum shopping, that powerful governments use their power to try and move the resolution of an issue to a fora where they have more voting rights or more resources or more power or influence. And I can imagine we're going to see a lot of that as we get into the detail of how these commitments are met and what sort of tools are appropriate. And I guess the third silence that I'd highlight before finishing is about, in relation to the climate issue, there's some positive language in there, but there's virtually no discussion about agreement around what percentage of fossil fuels will be left in the ground globally, which increasingly is obvious has to be the way forward in terms of tackling climate change, given arguments about unburnable carbon, etc. So I think this is really interesting, and I'm hoping that I'm wrong on some of this, but I just wanted to throw in a slightly more sanguine view on rising powers.
Thank you very much indeed, Pete. So that's, I think, with a brilliantly stimulating and often challenging set of presentations, gets us off to a pretty good start for a swift round of questions before we take our initial break. Do we have a mobile mic, or does this one need to go around the room?
There's mics in the ceiling, so if people speak up. So it's been
look towards
there's mics in the ceiling.
the heavens as you speak. Okay. So, do we have a couple of questions for our first round? Stunned silence. Is that okay? 1, 2. Okay. If this time I'll throw in mine, because of course chair's privilege and all that. But let's see how we get on with those two. So yes,
I'm slightly confused that the process is more democratic, but the idea, the framework is similar, like the development growth means same for all countries. So how does it make a difference? Because still there will be inequality, still there will be problems of the same nature, over-exploitation of resources, and every country will try to maximize their own personal benefits. So you said that it's much better to have so many goals and have so many indicators, but what is the point of having them, and the basic, shouldn't be there discussion on just 3-4 issues: inequality, poverty, and resources, 3 indicators.
Thank you. Let's take Ricardo's question, and then each of the panel can have a quick thought on that.
Hi. First of all, it's really my thought-provoking what has been shared, and one of the things that came to my mind is whether. So I think in a way the MDGs paved the way of how to creatively, flexibly interpret goals. Just take the goal on global cooperation and see how creatively it was interpreted in a way that actually was never followed. All through the 15 years, we actually missed that one. Everybody missed that one, and it started by not defining precise indicators on that one. And one of the things that I feel is whether the solution, the flexible solution that Rommel mentioned and Jenny mentioned in a way also, of the 17 goals, could bring about a pick and mix strategy on the goals. Now we have 17, and we'll pick up the ones we find are important. And what I see, I had the opportunity to read the Chinese government's position on the SDGs they presented last week. They put last week on their website. And it's interesting where they mention a lot the robust economic growth, inclusiveness, social justice being key things. On the climate change is the only point where they clearly mention common but differentiated responsibilities. That's where they say it clearly, which means probably they don't want to commit that much. And no mention whatsoever on the issue of political legitimacy, political settlement, and security. Pretty much no mention. The G7 Plus perspective when they went to the SDGs was that security, political legitimacy, and political settlement were paramount. Every other objective, every other goal was subordinated to that, because you couldn't reach growth if you didn't solve that problem if you are a fragile country. So it's kind of like a reinterpretation of what goal is more important, what we need to reach first, and all of that. And in Brazil, I found it very interesting, two things that were mentioned. One, that it was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that convened, so it's not a national issue. It's actually a diplomatic issue, because otherwise it would have been convened by the president, I guess. And this thing of voting with defeat. So some ministers already said, I really don't care. I'm not going to the meetings at all. So it's already some of the pick and mix shown, even in a country that committed to the full range of goals. So it's kind of like, can this be actually the next step? So we are going to adopt 17 goals, but then we'll pick and mix which ones we want.
Thanks, Ricardo. So complex and challenging set of questions there. I think what we'll probably do, because that merits a considered response probably from every member of the panel, is take our pause now. So if you want to hear what the panel think of those two questions, please stay with us. Those of you who have to sprint, we'll take a 60-second break now, so that those who have to go can go. And then while the panel gather their thoughts on those challenging questions. Okay, great. Well, it looks like most people will stay, which is fantastic. So I think we'll, in order of presentation, or in reverse order of presentation. Do you want to rise to the challenge, Roma?
Just wait people to leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Okay.
Okay.
You can take both questions. You're going to respond to both?
I think you're going to run.
Yeah, we'll do round. Okay.
Okay, just we can start so many questions. Well, it's a very important point is, does it help in terms of producing a new or starting a new, or helping to go deeper in this process of development? This is very, of course, is the key question about how is this important. First, let me tell you why I think this process has been very positive in that way. To be comprehensive implies to accept a wide set of interests in one agenda. For the minorities, this agenda is very important. For the environment, it's also very important. For those who are fighting against inequality, it's also very important. Because we can say, I mean, if we take the last 50 years or 100 years, we say, well, we have many progress in many areas, but still in the environmental side and the inequality, we are in a worse position than it used to be some time ago. Meaning that there's a demand, there's a need for a changing in the development process. So one thing we know, it's important to be inclusive, and it's important to inclusive not just about when we talk about people or about socioeconomic dimensions, but when we talk about to accept different interests inside the agenda. Another thing that is also important when you think about this is thinking about the different framework for the governance. Because if we now look, many times we think about power or international power as about capacity to implement what is your agenda and as you see what your national interest. However, to be successful on this, it's very important the trust. So it's not about power or not about just about the capacity each country has, but about trust. So what we see now is how to build up a new process where the countries can trust effectively in the process. But also it's a process based on consensus. So we should go in the way that is possible, what is feasible for the countries. So, in my perception is this is a very complex model, is still a way we are building up, but it's quite advanced from if you consider the other previous experience. Just a quickly comment about how countries are dealing with this. I've observed that the diplomats or diplomatic area has the responsibility for the negotiations. So in many countries, it has been in some way restricted to that area, close to the presidential cabinet, which is a problem because the countries are not using their full capacity to respond properly to the debate. The case of Brazil is interesting because it produces an opportunity for the all areas to contribute. This is very important. But remember, what's happening now, it's very restricted debate in many cases to the coordinating areas of the government. It's a pity in many cases because other countries have been very successful also to include civil society in the process. Not just the Scandinavian, there has amazing traditions about that, but other countries. I stop here to allow my colleagues here to.
Thanks. Who'd like to follow that? Jenny, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think Romulo has said some of the main points, but I guess both your questions are interlinked because it's a different take on the risk of pick and mix. And in a way, maybe it gives me a chance to respond a little bit to what Pete was saying in terms of my enthusiasm. This is an imperfect process, and it's a nascent process. I mean, the SDGs have not been finalized. We shouldn't see, I think we have a tendency, like Richard was saying, to see the goals as being the end all. Once they're decided, that paves the way forward. In a way, once they're decided, it opens the conversation to actually talk about the how. And the means of implementation are definitely very complex, and there is really a risk, like Ricardo said, of pick and mix. But at the same time, I think my enthusiasm in a way is simply because I think we're at a point of rupture, of change. I think that we're seeing a lot of change in terms of global governance institutions. We're seeing new configurations and constellations emerge, which, because of the economic and geopolitical clout of the countries behind them, actually means something. It's not like IBSA at the beginning of the 2000s when people went, oh yeah, India, Brazil and South Africa, they've got a partnership and they're doing cooperation and trying to enhance trade. Suddenly we have a group of countries who are powerful. So I think that the reason I'm enthusiastic about the SDGs and their potential is because there's still a concerted attempt by all these countries to come together and talk about something like the universal SDGs. Of course, a lot of it is, like others said, the Foreign Affairs Ministry negotiating, and what happens in the UN maybe isn't what we'll see there. So I think maybe, yeah, we might see some pick and mix, but I don't think that's necessarily problematic at the moment. I think the fact that there has been enough trust, like Romulo said, for people to sit around the table and think of a way forward should be heralded as something positive. And I maybe going back to Pete's point, but I think this is relevant as well. It's not that rising powers are necessarily setting themselves up as leaders. I think they're actually really reluctant to take on this mantle of leadership. And other countries, and the UK is a good example, has said, why isn't Brazil, for example, demonstrating leadership the way it did in, for example, the Rio +20 process? So much more should have been done since -- or even since the 70s. The SDGs are not new. I mean, this has been in the genesis almost of the UN. But again, there are different definitions of what it means to show leadership. And so I think maybe we need to wait and see and not assume that this is going to be an irrelevant process just because it's imperfect.
Well, I think I'm in a pretty similar place. I mean, do not oversell this whole SDG business. It's not going to change the world in its own right. The world, on the whole, tough international decisions get taken in a limited number of fora which are competent to take those decisions. The Paris meeting in December is a classic case in point. It was made very clear, it's in the zero draft, that the SDG negotiation is not going to be allowed to affect the Paris negotiation, because the Paris negotiation is about hard-edged issues. The example I always stick to is that there was a G8 meeting in St. Petersburg. My word, that takes you back, doesn't it? There was a G8 meeting in St. Petersburg, which all the G8 decided that the Doha round would be finished by December. And okay, the G8 didn't totally control the process because India, China, and Brazil and so on and others were very important, but the G8 leaders, having decided this, they didn't even fix the problems between the EU and the United States, because the trade negotiations in both Washington and Brussels were not terribly interested in what leaders happened to have put their name to in a piece of paper in St. Petersburg. They've got their competent forum, which is going to be where the deals are done. So don't expect, this is really the answer to the 0.7 point. The United States has never accepted the 0.7 target. Very, very few countries, except the well-known ones, including recently the UK, have ever set themselves a date for achieving it. Why are they going to do it now? They're not. They're doing it in some other forum if they ever do it. So I think that you have to see what this process is competent for, and I think the point made earlier, we need to bear in mind, these events can help to change the language. And changing the language is one of these, it's a soft intervention, but it helps the way issues are framed. That helps advocacy and so on. So don't expect these things to result in a we do this, therefore that happens result. They facilitate certain processes, particularly involving non-state actors, which eventually have an impact on states. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Thanks. Just a couple of quick comments. No, I agree with the sentiment of what's been said. Let's not expect SDGs to change the world. Although to go back to that very first question, sort of the note of cynicism about states inevitably pursuing their self-interest, etc. Again, I would echo what others have said. It's amazing, given that, if we want to be so cynical, that this has arisen at all. You know, if states behave in that sort of ultra-realist way, why have they set these very ambitious normative commitments, etc.? So, you know, I think there is some credit to the fact that these have arisen at all. So I think that is important. And I guess, to come back to Jennifer, I mean, my cynicism wasn't about the SDG process, nor around whether or not rising power should be the leaders. It's more around whether they project an alternative development model and what sort of position they have to do that. The point about pick and mix, I mean, I think pick and mix is both inevitable and possibly okay, because inevitably, if you look down the list here, looking at hunger, education, water, climate change, energy, not every state in social society has the resources or the ability or the capacity or the responsibility, frankly, to address each of those things. So if someone somewhere is doing it, it's okay. So some element of pick and mix is okay, and I guess that's intrinsic to the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. These are shared goals, but people will achieve them in different ways. As one great development thinker once said, to each according to their need, from each according to their ability. Karl Marx.
Thanks very much indeed, Pete. Okay, so we have time for another round. Can I get a sense of how many people would like to ask a question? It may have to be just the one round. How many? So we have 1, 2... Looks like we'll have time for leisurely answers. In which case, I'll throw in my third. Hannah? Okay. So we have 2 questions plus mine if there's time, and then we'll have a further round of reflections from the panel. Thanks. So,
yeah, thanks. That was really interesting and stimulating. I'm Andy Newsham, and I'm on holiday, so not divulging my institutional affiliation.
This is how you spend your holiday.
It's a
terrible way.
Continuity and change. I know it's a difficult thing to distinguish. So my question is, I mean, maybe the pick and mix sort of being okay sort of resolves this, but picking up on the funding issues and how much funding is really connected to the SDG process, if there are a lot more objectives to be achieved, is there really going to be a lot more money thrown at it? I just ask that as a sort of, I have no idea of what, where countries are thinking in terms of their financing. And just on this issue of pick and mix, is it politically feasible within the SDG process to simply acknowledge that some countries are more relevant in terms of dealing with some issues? Like you wouldn't really expect, Namibia to do as much in the way of mitigation as the United States, for example. That's a really obvious example, but is there room sort of to, and this whole thing about recognising who's got capacity to do what, is there the room to do that, or would it then sink the idea of universal commitment to the SDGs?
Thank you. Hubert?
We're dealing with a political process, and this point was made by several of you. It's a process that shakes up old groups, that brings together new configurations, and I would add that perhaps it's an apprenticeship that we are undergoing, in a soft process, an apprenticeship for a hard process on a later occasion. And new processes, new vocabulary, new language, all this helps. And who knows, perhaps it has all an integrating effect. And I'm wondering whether it could have an integrating effect for us here at the Institute. And the SDG cover many areas. We at IDS, we cover many areas, in my view too many. And the question is whether this can help us to come together. I think it could, if we were all to address the same question in our respective areas, nutrition, climate, hunger, whatever. And my question to the panel is, what would be the question that you would like us, as IDS, to address if we were to make a positive contribution to the implementation process, which Romelu advocated is really the key thing for the future.
Thank you. Okay, so unless anyone else has had a question occur to them in the meantime, I will pitch in with mine. So I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on the implications for countries of the global north. Various speakers have alluded to the potential challenge that universality poses. Roman has reminded us that some countries are less adaptable than others, potentially because they think they've sorted these things already, and we're actually asking them in the SDG process to rethink that. So I'd like your reflections on that and on the role that Rising Powers in particular, in the Rising Powers programme and the Centre for Rising Powers and Development here in Sussex, we talk a lot about mutual learning and multi-directional learning, which doesn't prejudge where valuable learning for means of implementation is going to come from. We think a lot of the innovation is going to come from countries in Africa and elsewhere where we currently don't necessarily look for leadership on these issues. But the Rising Powers have a particular role in relation to this, which is the fact that they are engaging in real-time innovation as a matter of political necessity. Sorting this stuff really matters if you're China or Brazil, because you're dealing with considerable political tensions around the limits of sustainability and inequality. So I'd like to know, first of all, whether that gives the Rising Powers some kind of special contribution to make, and then what do you think the barriers might be, or potentially the entry points might be, for a more constructive dialogue? We started off hearing from Jenny that the initial starting point for this briefing was being told by a lot of interlocutors in established donor countries that the BRICS and the other Rising Powers are being difficult and unhelpful. What's it going to take for us to get beyond that? Where are the entry points? Make of that what you will in the time remaining, as well as the very questions asked by Andy and Hubert. So, any volunteers to start off?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to slightly cheat in replying to your question, Andy, and say that I think CBDR is probably the answer there. Common but differentiated responsibilities, both in terms of responsibilities, but also rights and implementation. The financing one is a tougher one, and I might defer to my colleagues on that one. There are gaps, there is a shortfall, and I think that's going to be quite a challenge. But I also think that it's not necessarily, the key problem now I don't think is necessarily about money. I think it's about getting the political process right, and I think it's about getting the means of implementation, the how, right, and that means that people have to continue sitting around the table. I might also skip on Hubert's question because I need to think about that a bit more. But I think actually that learning from the process of the SDGs would be an interesting one, which is to move away from our silos and sit around the table in different configurations, recognizing the change and the rupture that's currently happening. And here we can go from the macro to the very micro of IDS, and realize that the level of interconnectivity between these different thematic areas, we're stronger together. There's no that we can't really continue to sit in our little silos trying to work out these things. And I think that's what the SDGs are trying to do, is to put everyone in the same space and say we've got to sort it out. Which in a way perhaps brings me to your question, and this isn't as considered as I would like it to be. But I think it comes back to what I was saying to Andy's question about it perhaps not being about money, but as you said, being about knowledge. Alex is nodding because we're both doing work on mutual learning and multi-directional knowledge and learning. So this is dear to our hearts. But I think it's going back to, again, the role that rising powers have here. I think where my enthusiasm continues for rising powers is because they have, not consistently, but many of them, Mexico, Brazil, India, China, have actually achieved remarkable developmental gains in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of tackling inequality. Not perfect processes, inequality reduction in Brazil has actually stalled a little bit. But I think that if knowledge is going to be the new currency of how we move forward in these debates, looking at what was done in countries that have dealt with the kind of challenges that developed countries are starting to have to deal with now, which is rising inequality, the impact of protracted financial crises, instability in terms of protests, and we've seen this in many countries that we didn't necessarily expect. I think there's something to be learned from the likes of Brazil and Mexico and China, who've had to deal with very, very, very rapid change, sometimes with limited resources, starting from a very low base and dealing with enormous complexity because of the size of their populations and very diverse needs. Also thinking of minorities, Brazil has done interesting group. I think, who was it? Pete was saying, who are we the peoples? So Brazil, for example, I think we have a lot to learn as to how social protection policies, and Romelu can talk about this with great authority, how they've been targeted at, for example, indigenous communities or Afro-descendants, or the urban poor or the rural poor. So I would say the lesson maybe for the North is to say, okay, let's move away from North-South politics, as Melissa Leach says. Let's we're beyond the North-South divide, and let's talk about how we find forum shopping, someone said as well, to actually use some of this knowledge to try and achieve a more sustainable development for our planet, I guess.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I think we're going to just jump over Romelu, since he's the person who's come furthest to be on the panel. I can give him the last word. And then go to Richard.
Well, three very good questions. Just on resourcing, clearly resourcing is important, and a fair critique of the MDGs is that they set up a series of outcomes without any very clear plan for getting to them. The Financing for Development Conference will look at this again. The model I had in my head when this whole process started was that one should move away from international target setting towards basically national target setting, because that way you get more ownership. So if I was doing it from scratch, I would set some high-level goals for each of these areas, and then let each country decide what targets are we going to set ourselves by maybe intermediate dates or wherever, and let's look at that, see how our neighbours are doing, and come back to it and make it part of the politics. After all, at the end of the day, it's all part of domestic politics, and it should be. So, but at the same time, I think that you should also have a set of minimum standards that everybody has to achieve. We cannot allow certain extreme poverty and the rest of it to go on existing when we know we can get rid of it. So there's a series of things where you could say, well, these are standards that every country should meet, and that then should be backed by resources that are fit for purpose, taking account of what domestic taxation can raise, which isn't very much in some of these countries, and hence some real commitment by the international community to resource that. I don't quite see that model emerging from this, but that, I think, is a good way of thinking about it. On this common but differentiated responsibilities is a well-known mantra of everybody, and I think that what you're seeing is this really, to my mind, rather unhelpful conversation in which the OECD countries, who, as I say, are on the whole rather overrepresented, saying they want, in the governments, saying that they want the countries who are becoming more important to play a bigger share of financing. That's fine, but there's two sides to this trade. It's not going to work unless both sides do it. And similarly, I entirely agree that it's most unreasonable for China to commit itself to 0.7% of GNI. China's a very poor country. I remember talking to a Chinese diplomat in Fiji about 10 years ago. He said, "I don't know what I'm giving aid to Fiji for. They're richer than we are." And one of the reasons the Chinese don't talk much about aid domestically is I don't think it's terribly popular in the average Chinese town to learn that China's shipping money abroad. So we have to be realistic about this, and to my mind, the 0.7 target is rather feeble as well. I did a little graph in which I simply related this to people's GNI, and it turns out that Norway, which thinks it's extremely generous, is in fact not at all generous, because it's so much richer than the rest of us. It ought to be doing far more than the 1% it's giving. So if you took it like that, you can make some relationships. On Hubert's point, this is a fascinating question. I think that what I would say to IDS is that it's very positive that we've got a clear focus on inequality in the SDGs. This is quite a bit unexpected in a way. It's going to be there. And there is a very interesting, and I think we need a more intelligent discussion around inequality, its various dimensions, what it means, what are the driving factors. WIDER has a nice program of work in the economic space. IDS has a lot of things to bring to this from a whole series of bits of IDS. But it needs to be, I think a lot of the inequality discussion is far too back of the envelope, we know the answer kind of thing. I think it's just a highly complicated topic. And IDS is well placed to have some really serious, very hard-edged research on what are the factors that move it and don't move it. Nora's done, as you know, a lot of work in Latin America on this, but I think it's a very proper subject for some rather more serious academic involvement than maybe some of the stuff that comes out from a series of institutions about rather bemoaning it, but not really seeing, well, what are the levers that you can actually pull in the real world. And that links also to the learning in the North from policies in the rising powers. I think IDS is well placed to play one role there. There are, of course, some very interesting examples. There's the one about New York social protection. But let's not just look at the rising, let's look at the BRICS. What about Kenya and mobile money, which is gradually percolating northwards? There are a lot of good ideas out there. Africa's got many more. There is, in the MDGs, there was a target on, or an indicator at least, on fixed line telephone connections. Africa's gone way past that one. But I think the lesson I learned, I was chair of the DAC in Paris at the OECD for several years, and I went to this job knowing a lot about the DAC and not much about the OECD. And I came back with the feeling that the OECD, which always gets kind of targeted as the rich person's club and all the rest of it, is actually, in many ways, a very useful way of thinking about the world. What the OECD is, it's a set of communities of practice between governments around a whole series of issues that are important to all of them, in none of which legislation is going to be mandated internationally, but where there's huge scope for looking at good practice, norms, informal agreements, soft law, and the rest of it. And OECD has gradually been, after it has a Mexican Secretary General and has had for years, it's building its relationships with a wider group of countries. The problem is that it's difficult to have an OECD-type conversation with 180 countries. The mechanisms don't work very well for that. But I'm a strong believer, I think, in let's develop more communities of practice. Let's forget about North, let's forget about South. Let's build communities of practice in all these areas where all countries have, different situations, but it's a very similar set of challenges. And I think there's great scope to do that. And just one final point for IDS to think about. I do think that another advantage of organisations like IDS is the ability to think long term. From that point of view, I think that a greater understanding of what is the long-term consequences of demographic change, which is one of the few things that's fairly predictable, would be a very proper subject to get more attention to IDS, because it forms the background to why China's going to slow down, how Africa is going to have a phenomenal share of working-age population in 40 years' time or so. And these big, long-term, slow-moving things, I think academics have a great role in signalling those in advance to policymakers who only think about them when the money runs out.
topics very much indeed, Richard. So, Pete?
Sure, okay. Hubert's question around new questions for IDS. I mean, I'd actually think we don't need a new question. It's a massive consolidation exercise that needs to go on in a way. If you look at all these key areas, hunger, education, gender equality, water, energy, there's so much work that's been gone on here and around the world for so many years. I think the key thing is trying to dissect and get to the bottom of which sort of policies and interventions work, when, how and for whom. It's really, you'd always want to say cluster groups of people around energy, water, gender equality, whatever it might be, and say, well, you know, what do we already know works in the particular context, in particular sectors, and then cutting through that, of course, the cross-cutting things around, you know, gender and other social dynamics. It strikes me, you know, with this is the whole development agenda in a way. This is everything we've ever done, really. So let's not lose sight of everything we know already. So rather than new questions, in a way, I think it's a massive consolidation exercise about bringing to bear everything we already or think we know about these things, and then trying to get us, because I guess all of this will come down to the details of, you know, which tools, interventions work in particular contexts, ultimately, beyond these big sort of banner targets. So I think that's where the contribution comes. Alex's point about the global north in all of this, and, you know, that rising powers are doing the real-time innovation. I hear that, although I'd also say we do a lot of that in the global north, the real-time innovation in terms of how you square inequality and growth, and how we deal with child poverty, which apparently no longer exists, etc. So there's, you know, I think the lessons sort of run always there. And I guess thinking about the climate context and this discussion about let's go beyond north and south, in a way it's hard to do that, particularly around climate change, but not just climate change, because it's all about the historical responsibility. And that is not totally on north-south lines, and of course it's changing, but that's a big part of the story. And so where you get to how you bring in north and south, I mean, as you know, in the climate context, people often talk about contraction and convergence. So precisely goal number 7, if you're serious about reliable, sustainable, modern energy for all, that requires an expansion of, some people say, the 1.6 billion people in the world without electricity, where someone's going to have to reduce their emissions and reduce their electricity and energy consumption to accommodate that. So that's the sort of one part of the world is going to have to give to accommodate the legitimate development demands of others, and that's how the two things get linked in.
Let me start telling about 2 meetings that I attended in the last 2 weeks previous to come to UK. One is I had a meeting with the Statistical Bureau of Statistics of Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Venezuela, and Brazil. And now just checking the potential indicators of each target. They were very happy with the demographic indicators because they are Bureau of Statistics. So they have a lot of comments about the others indicators they are not really responsible for. A lot of suggestions, but about the set of the demographic indicators, they are so happy. I also saw a meeting with 70 federal organizations of Brazil in the same issue, analyzing the indicators. Everyone seemed to be happy with the indicators of their areas, but a lot of comments and suggestions about how to reduce the other areas. So what is my point here? My point is, I do believe there is some room for changing in the indicators, but I really don't believe that in the case of the targets are going to happen a big change, at least for now. I think the countries will in some way be represented by the targets, and they will, maybe even the targets can change a little. Maybe 21 targets, I bet. We can define the what is, but I believe that 21 maybe will be dropped in the end. But in relation to the goals, they will remain, and also it will be a commitment for all countries. I like to rephrase your question, Hubert. What could be the contribution of IDS to that process now? I think the IDS has an amazing moment because it started the Raising Powers initiative some time ago. It has worked with development. It's material. It has been worked with this. And now, if we think about first this work, I like very much to participate. I like it to participate that because it was about interpretation. It's very important to help to translate the process using the South lens. It's very important. It has been amazing opportunity to speak here to many people in the UK how different can be a perception about the same process. So it helps to translate what's going on. And I think it's something as that could be a good contribution if you do this Champollion task, this Rosetta Stone exercise for this. A second is about implementation. It's to use your capacity in many areas how to help to contribute about implementation. In international, but also in the national perspective. So how countries can adapt from this wide framework, and also how can they interact. So you can have a contribution as, of course, research, presenting evidence, and also training. I guess that can be an amazing opportunity because you are ready to, in some way, to start this immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Romulo. Thank you to all the members of the panel. I must say I thought that was a fantastically stimulating discussion, and thank you so much to all of you who've stayed, and particularly those who asked questions. I think we've been left with a couple of nice challenges there. First we have to produce the compendium, and then we have to translate it with the Rosetta Stone for the SDGs. And we've also been left with a challenge. So if the number of targets is reduced by 21, we have to...
No. To reduce it to the targets to 149.
Oh, to reduce 240 to exactly 149 targets,
yeah, exactly.
Then we have to find the money to pay for Romulo to come back and tell us why he was right. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.